By sunrise on August 29th, 1886, the thermometer nailed to the post outside Ketterly General Goods read 41 degrees, though the previous afternoon had touched 79, and the wind that moved down Sage Hollow carried the dry metallic taste that came when summer gave one warning and then withdrew. The settlement held 318 souls by the church ledger, arranged along a single wind-cut street with two stock ponds at opposite ends, and every livelihood in town depended on animals that could pull, breed, or survive one more winter. Sage Hollow sat 6 wagon miles from the nearest Badland shelves and farther still from reliable rail delivery once snows reached the passes. In good weather, the distance felt manageable. In bad weather, it became governance, law, and hunger. Men standing at hitch rails still spoke of autumn cattle prices, of fence paint, of roofing nails, as if weather were an inconvenience that could be bargained with. Roy Murray worked with Square, Level, and Ads that morning without joining those conversations, and in the quiet around him lay the first shape of the season to come. He had once been known as a carpenter who talked while he worked, explaining grain direction, load paths, and why a gate that swung smoothly in July could fail in January when wood shrank and iron stiffened. After the previous winter, his voice thinned to measured statements and long pauses. Clara Murray had died on January the 17th, 1886, in a storm that came early and hard, when a plank corral gate split at its lower tenon under panic pressure from a gelding string and dropped her into a drifted hinge lane. The men who reached her did so quickly by frontier standards. The cold reached first. Roy buried her on a slope above the south pond where willow roots held the soil, and through spring thaw he returned to work because labor was the one language in town that did not demand explanation. Clara had not been ornamental to his craft. She had been half of it. Her father, Ewan Price, came from Welsh mining country, where timbering and stonework shared one discipline. Every structure failed first where two materials met, and pride had replaced measurement. Price had spent 22 years setting supports in wet shafts and building retaining walls that had to hold against pressure men could not see. During Roy and Clara's first year in Wyoming territory, Price lived with them through one winter and taught Roy to read fossilized logs scattered in Badland shelves east of Sage Hollow. He did not call them curiosities. He called them delayed timber, wood transformed by mineral water until the fibers carried stone density and yet retained directional strength if cut along old grain lines. He taught wedge sequencing with chalk marks, slit depth by tapping tone, and joint seating with iron dogs rather than brittle pegs. Walls fail at joints, not at pride, he said so often that Clara repeated it while boiling coffee, while sweeping, while standing with Roy at any new job site where a client demanded speed above soundness. When Price died of lung fever in 1883, he left no money and little furniture, but he left notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, each page packed with hand measurements and correction marks from projects that had remained standing after floods and cave-ins took neighboring work. Roy kept those notebooks in a pine chest beneath his bench. He opened them at night by lamplight even after he had committed most pages to memory, not from sentiment but from discipline, and because he had seen what happened when a frontier town mistook familiar methods for permanent truth. By the second week of September, the social distance around him had become visible even to travelers who stayed only one night. Ranchers still hired him for barn braces and wagon tongues, yet they stopped asking him to sit at supper. Women who had once sent Clara preserves now nodded from porches without crossing the street. Grief unsettled communities that depended on routine, and Roy's new work unsettled them further. He had purchased Lot 9 on the narrow rise west of town, land others called dead ground, because topsoil sat thin over caliche, and bunch grass grew in sparse patches. The parcel cost $38 because no one expected crops from it, and no one wanted to fight rock for post holes. Roy wanted exactly that resistance. He began with stakes and line before dawn on September 14th, setting a rectangle 132 feet long and 84 feet wide, then dividing the interior into 3 holding courts and 1 feed lane, angled away from prevailing northwest wind. Standard pine rails in Sage Hollow sold at $19 per 1,000 board feet that season, and a finished corral of that size could be raised cheaply if one accepted a 10-year life. Roy accepted no such term. Through a freight broker who served failed quarry claims, he bought discarded petrified logs from Badland cuts at $1.20 per ton, paid $4 per wagon haul, and tracked every load in a notebook with column lines straight as saw curves. The first week brought 32 tons. The second brought 41. Teamsters laughed at the weight. Their axles did not. Each fossil log had to be chosen, not merely lifted. Roy rejected pieces with radial fractures, saved cores with dense ring continuity, and marked cut lines in red ochre where old growth direction still showed beneath mineral skin. He built a splitting cradle from green oak and iron straps, then used twin wedges set 1 finger width apart to open the logs without shattering them. The sound of good stonewood under wedge was neither wood crack nor rock break. It was a deep report, followed by a clean sigh as the split traveled true. Town boys gathered to hear it, then mimicked the sound as they passed, calling him grave digger and tomb builder, amused at a man turning hard relics into fence posts for living stock. Roy answered with procedure. Each main post stood 7 feet above grade and 3 feet below, 10 feet total, sunk into sockets enlarged to 18 inches and backfilled with tamped gravel and slaked lime in alternating 6-inch lifts. He checked plumb with a brass bob line twice per setting, once wet and once after settlement. Corner assemblies carried forged iron dogs 12 inches long, heated and hammered by Olin Voss at the smithy for 9 cents apiece, then driven across pre-cut sockets that locked adjacent posts against torsion when crowds of animals pressed from one side. Horizontal members were not nailed rails but seated beams, each with shoulder cuts that transferred force downward into mast rather than outward into fasteners. At gate mouths he set double posts and hung inward canted leaves, so any panic surge tightened closure instead of blowing it open. On September 23rd, Darius Wainwright halted his polished buckboard beside the lot and watched 2 teamsters unload another wagon of stonewood. He wore a broadcloth coat despite the heat, boots black to mirror shine, and gloves too fine for any task involving rope or mud. Wainwright had built half the false confidence of Sage Hollow, from painted storefront fronts to quick pine stockades sold as progress in 20-day contracts. He asked Roy, loud enough for the gathered men, whether grief had turned his judgment to masonry dreams. Roy kept working. Wainwright laughed and told the crowd that Murray was fencing horses inside a tomb and that no sane rancher would trust live blood to graveyard rock. Several men repeated the insult before sundown, but no single label held. Roy gave no speech in return. He measured shoulder depth again, reset a beam that sat 1/8 inch high, and paid the teamsters in exact coin. Late that evening, as wind dropped and pond surfaces went black beneath a narrow moon, he stood alone inside the unfinished rectangle and checked spacing one more time by lantern. 20-inch stone ribs on the windward side, wider intervals on the lee, future earth backing marked by lime dust and stakes. The design had already exceeded common practice in cost and effort, yet it was still only a private structure in the town's eyes, a widower's hard project on worthless ground. Roy drove the final marker for the outer line, blew out the lantern, and turned toward the house where Clara's apron still hung behind the kitchen door. The work had begun in grief. It would continue as instruction. On October 3rd, after Ketterly posted a weather supply warning that early snow in the passes might leave only one regular freight run, men packed the storefront to argue priorities. Wainwright seized that audience, repeated his tomb remark, and for the first time christened Roy's project the Murray Tomb Fence. By nightfall, the name had spread through every stable lane in Sage Hollow. By first light on October 4th, 1886, the temperature had fallen to 34 degrees, and frost sat in the wagon ruts like ground glass, while Roy Murray set his level against the western run of stone posts and listened to Sage Hollow repeat Darius Wainwright's phrase as if naming made judgment true. Men crossing to the feed store said Murray Tomb Fence with a grin meant for witnesses, not for Roy. And boys at the pond embankment threw shale chips that clattered harmlessly against the petrified uprights and scattered into the grass. The insult moved quickly because it carried theater, and because a frontier town preferred confidence over arithmetic when winter remained hypothetical. Yet the same morning, Ketterly sold out of lamp oil by noon, and 2 freighters argued over the last sacks of barley mash. Stakes were no longer abstract. If rail cuts closed early, every horse in Sage Hollow would become heat, transport, medicine, burial labor, and spring planting all at once. Roy worked through the talk with the discipline Clara had once called his second pulse, not hurried but relentless, and his method made plain that he was no longer building for one household enclosure. He widened the north approach from 14 feet to 20, so 2 loaded teams could pass without tangling traces, shifted the inner partition 6 feet east to increase standing space for draft pairs, and marked a secondary gate line for emergency intake. He bought additional iron from Olin Voss, 68 pounds at 7 cents per pound, and had Voss forge hinge straps with doubled knuckles and offset pins that would not seize when rime built in the barrels. He paid cash each time, counting coins into Voss's palm without bargaining, then carried the finished pieces home wrapped in burlap to keep dust from the mating surfaces. By October 8th, he had begun laying a packed earth backing against the inner windward wall, not decorative fill but thermal mass, tamped in 8-inch lifts and watered from casks until each core set hard as kiln floor. 3 days later, under a noon sun that reached 63 degrees and gave false comfort to every porch in town, Darius Wainwright came again with 2 ranch clients and stood at Roy's gate long enough to gather an audience. Wainwright's broadcloth sat smooth, his hat brim clean, and his speech carried the relaxed authority of a man whose ledgers had rarely punished him. He asked whether Roy intended to stable horses or bury them upright, then told the clients that stone did not flex and animals did not reason, and that panic would shatter any hard pen faster than pine ever failed. Roy listened, finished setting an iron dog across a corner socket, and answered in one sentence without looking up. Let them talk. Words do not keep out the wind. Wainwright laughed for the crowd and left to sign 2 light coral contracts near the church, each priced lower than Roy could have offered with pine, let alone stonewood. Practical truth lost daily to short-term cost, and everyone watching knew it. By the second week of October, Roy had begun sleeping 4 hours at a stretch and keeping a second notebook for feed arithmetic. He walked to the Badlands shelves before dawn on hauling days, selected loads by fracture pattern and ring continuity, and rejected nearly 1 log in 5 despite having paid haul fees in advance. A bad piece set in a critical line could cost more later than 10 good pieces purchased now. Teamster Eli Garner, who had hauled for mines before wagoning grain, asked him once why he discarded so much expensive material when no client stood waiting. Roy answered that pressure had no patience for compromise. Eli did not laugh, and after that he stacked rejected sections by size instead of tossing them, allowing Roy to cut them into shorter rib braces and threshold blocks. Not all mockery came from malice. Much came from ignorance protected by routine. The routine began to crack. On October the 16th, Roy purchased rope in quantity for the first time in his life. 900 feet of half-inch hemp, tarred at 11 cents per foot, plus 120 feet of lighter lead line for blind movement drills with nervous stock. The clerk at Ketterly General Goods, under instruction from Darius's circle, denied him 30 days credit and required immediate payment for every coil. Roy laid down $112.20 from a tin box of savings and carried the rope himself in 3 trips. He set cedar posts at 6-foot intervals from main gate to feed shed, capped each with smooth iron rings, and strung a double lane chest-high and knee-high so a handler with frozen lashes and no clear sight could keep one hand to line and one hand to halter and still move forward in whiteout. He tested the path at dusk by walking it 10 times with his eyes covered by wool cloth. On the 7th pass, he adjusted ring height by 2 inches. On the 10th, he noted no snags. Sage Hollow answered competence with ridicule sharpened into social policy. At church steps, Wainwright spoke of stewardship and prudence and said some grief turned men inward until they mistook stubbornness for duty. Ranch wives who had known Clara since her arrival stood silent beside him, not endorsing, not resisting, simply preserving their place in the town's center of gravity. Boys carved tomb fence into a fence rail near the pump. A pair of hired hands drove a green colt near Roy's lot one evening, hoping to set off a panic and prove stone pens dangerous. But Roy and Eli blocked the lane before the colt reached the gate, calmed the animal with a hooded blanket, and sent the men away without a blow. The next morning, Roy found 2 gate pins missing. He replaced them with peened heads that could not be lifted by hand, and said nothing to anyone. In late October, warning signs multiplied with a precision older than county records. Beavers on Willow Draw raised their dams above Springcrest by nearly a foot and sealed side channels earlier than usual. Geese crossed 3 major flights in 1 week, flying lower and in tighter wedges, and did not return on backdraft days. Cattle on the East Flats bunched with noses north even under mild noon temperatures, then refused lower pasture where they had grazed each autumn for years. Roy noted each sign in the margins of Price's old notebook and added dates beside them, not as superstition, but as accumulated evidence. On October the 29th, he rode 6 miles to the Badland Rim and watched mare tails of ice cloud stream from the western highline by midday. That night a ring formed around the moon, thin and hard as hammered silver. It appeared again the next night, and the next. November opened with deceptive gentleness. On November 2nd, Sage Hollow reached 58 degrees at noon, warm enough for children to run coatless between porches, warm enough for men at the hitch rail to declare that mountain snow would stay in the mountain this year. Freight wagons still arrived twice weekly, and Ketterly stacked flour sacks high against the back wall in visible abundance. Darius used that abundance as argument. He told anyone listening that markets rewarded nerve, that overbuilding wasted capital, and that winter fear was bad business. He secured 3 more corral jobs with pine rail and shallow set posts, each painted bright, each completed quickly, each praised for economy. Roy passed those sites with his tools on a handcart and said nothing against them in public. He had no taste for humiliation theater, and he had seen too often how pride disguised itself as reason when weather had not yet passed sentence. By November 10th, Roy's ledger showed $214.60 spent since September, nearly all he and Clara had saved after medical fees and burial costs. The number would have frightened any prudent man. Roy treated it as fixed obligation. He bought 6 wagon loads of cut hay at post-harvest rates, $13 per load delivered, tested moisture by twist and break, and rejected 1 full load that steamed when packed, paying haul but not hay to avoid rot and reserve. He stacked the accepted bales on cedar skids under tarred canvas, 6 reserve mounds in all, each tied with cross-lashed rope and weighted with stonewood offcuts so no gust could peel the covers in a night blow. He dug a drainage swale around the stacks, 1 foot deep and 18 inches wide, sloped to a gravel pit at the southeast corner. He marked ration calculations on a wallboard: pounds per head, temperature adjustments, labor team priority, broodmare reserve. 3 days passed before the first external confirmation reached town. A rail teamster from the Laramie Cut came in with 2 exhausted mules and reported drifts already shoulder-high in shaded sections, plus 1 stalled freight train that required hand shoveling for half a mile. The report split Sage Hollow down familiar lines. Some souls bought extra lamp wicks and salt pork by evening. Others said teamsters always dramatized for tips. Darius stood near the pump and called the account mountain exaggeration, then joked that if Fear sold lumber he would be rich by spring. Yet even he ordered additional oats for his branded stock the next morning. And when Ketterly quietly raised feed prices by 9%, no one protested loudly enough to force them down. Scarcity had entered the room, still dressed as rumor, already doing arithmetic. Mid-November carried a wind that seldom rested. Roy finished the final inner divider on November 18th, then spent 4 full days on details no observer praised, chamfering gate edges to prevent rope wear, chiseling runoff channels in threshold stones, fitting removable slat screens for drift control, and driving extra iron dogs into every corner where 2 force lines met. He set lantern hooks at measured intervals along the rope lane and filled each with protected glass lamps he had bought secondhand from a retired survey crew. On November 22nd, he tested the entire intake sequence with Eli and 2 borrowed farm horses, including blindfold turns, stalled movement, feed station rotation, and controlled release by group, and he timed each phase by pocket watch. The first run took 52 minutes and produced 1 tangle. He altered order. The second took 38 with no tangle. Procedure became architecture. Thanksgiving passed with clear sky and brittle grass. By the first week of December, side roads began to crust at dawn and soften only briefly at noon, a pattern that snapped wagon axles when drivers misjudged weight transfer in ruts. Roy helped mend 2 broken tongues on other men's rigs and accepted flour instead of cash. He kept hauling stonewood between repairs, adding low buttress ribs along the north wall where crosswind strike would be greatest, and packed the final earth backing until it stood nearly shoulder-high against the inside face. He mounted a board over the main gate with intake marks burned into it. Teams, broodmares, saddle stock, infirm. There was no ornament. There was order. On December 20th, the first sealing snow came in before dawn, fine and dry, turning to hard grain by noon under a north wind that held at 27 miles per hour and dropped evening temperature to 9 degrees. Side roads vanished first, then fence lines. By supper, only the main street remained visible between drifts, and lantern light reached no farther than arm's length. Roy made 1 final round with Eli and closed every gate pin in sequence, checked all rope lanes for ice glaze, and tightened tarp lines over the 6 hay reserves until the knots rang hard under his gloves. Across Sage Hollow, pine rails creaked but still stood, and many called that proof enough. Roy did not argue. He banked his stove, hung his coat by Clara's apron, and laid the ledger open to the ration page, where the ink waited for numbers that would soon no longer be theoretical. The snow that sealed the side roads on December 20th did not move out again. It settled, hardened, and became foundation for what followed. Roy sat at his kitchen table with the ration board carried in from the gatehouse, added columns for reduced work output under deep cold, and copied each figure twice so a tired hand could still read it by lantern smoke. At midnight, he returned to the corral with a shovel, a short maul, and a sack of iron staples. clearing drift from the inward canted gates and testing every hinge strap by full swing. Ice had formed in 2 lower pin channels. He chipped it clean, warmed the metal with a banked coal pan, and packed rendered tallow into each sleeve so the movement would not cease when temperatures dropped below zero. By dawn on 21st December, he had marked the first emergency occupancy limit in charcoal above the main lane. 112 head in storm compression, 84 for stable rotation. No exceptions unless draft teams were failing. Through the next 4 days, he treated his own body as another tool to be scheduled. He slept in 2 short intervals, one before midnight and one after noon, and spent the remaining hours converting a good enclosure into a hard weather system. The western wall received snowshed baffles cut from rejected stonewood slabs and set at a shallow angle to split crosswind before it struck the animal mass. He widened 3 turn bays from 6 feet to 8 to prevent shoulder lock when teams entered blind. He built a heated mash trench beside the feed shed, lining it with broken fire brick and clay so water could be thawed in batches without carrying kettles through drift. When a gate latch failed under repeated ice loading, he replaced all 4 with lever latches forged from wagon spring stock, each one operable with mittened hands. Eli Garner worked beside him without question, hauling gravel in a drag box and tamping fill in measured lifts while Roy checked every compacted course with a steel rod and listening taps. The sound of a void was dull. The sound of proper set rang. By Christmas week, the project extended beyond fence lines into movement and triage. Roy divided the interior into arrival, settling, and reserve courts with rope partitions that could be dropped in seconds if a horse went down. He built 2 low warming stalls for chilled foals and injured animals, each enclosed on 3 sides with earth-backed wall and fitted with vent slots that released damp air without drawing heat from body level. He hung numbered boards above feed positions and matched those numbers to slate tags for halters, so handlers could rotate rations by condition rather than ownership. On December 26th, he paid Allen Voss $6.40 for 32 additional iron rings and had them set at shoulder height along the rope lane, then paid Eli $2.50 sack of flour for a full day of drilling teams through entry order in blowing snow. They timed every run. First pass, 46 minutes. Second pass, 35. Third pass, 31. Procedure was reducing panic before panic arrived. Darius Wainwright watched this expansion from horseback on the afternoon of December 27th, sitting high in a dark saddle with a buffalo collar coat over his broadcloth and a silk scarf tied in a knot, too fine for field work. He had lost none of his public confidence. At Ketterly's hitch rail, he said Roy had transformed one man's sorrow into municipal theater, and that no town should surrender stock management to a private yard built from dead timber and fear. He had 3 new pine contracts completed before New Year, each one painted and braced for appearance, each one sold with the same promise of economy that had built his name. He persuaded the fee committee to assign limited town oats by contract priority, which placed Roy last on paper despite the reserve already standing on his own lot. The gesture carried more message than material. It told Sage Hollow where status still sat. The exclusion sharpened over days. Ketterly refused bulk salt purchase unless Roy paid an extra hauling surcharge that no one else paid. A church elder asked Roy to leave his measuring pole outside on Sundays because the marked stick unsettled worshippers who were tired of hearing winter arithmetic. 2 hired hands from Wainwright's south parcel dragged a broken pine rail to Roy's gate and leaned it there as a joke marker, carved with the words "Tomb Fence" in crude letters. Roy removed it before dawn, cut it into stove lengths, and stacked it by the smithy for anyone needing kindling. He did not return a message and did not repeat an insult. When rancher Thomas Hale met him by chance near the pump and asked whether the stone posts would shatter under a hard kick, Roy answered with demonstration. He took Hale to the west corner, struck the post at 3 heights with a 10-pound maul, then showed the iron dogs locking force into adjacent mass. Hale ran his glove across the surface, said nothing further, and walked back through blowing grit with his collar up. On December the 29th, the town council met in the schoolhouse with 6 lamps burning and boots lined along the wall to dry. Wainwright chaired the discussion, though he held no formal office, and he pressed for a resolution discouraging unverified stock concentration on private lots during crisis, arguing disease risk and liability. Deputy Marshal Edwin Pike objected that no ordinance covered storm refuge and that enforcement in whiteout would be fiction. Lena Crowley, who managed the church kitchen and knew every household ledger by memory, asked who would feed animals if 3 pine yards failed in one night. Wainwright answered with figures from fair weather capacity sheets. Roy, standing near the stove with hat in hand, offered no speech. He laid his own occupancy board on a desk, listed available hay by weight, and stated the intake sequence in 12 plain lines. The council adopted no ordinance and adjourned in discomfort, leaving policy suspended and pride intact. 3 days passed before the next freight report arrived, and it came by exhausted messenger instead of wagon. A rail hand from the East Spur rode in on a lathered bay at noon on January 1st, 1887, and delivered written notice that 2 cars of feed had not cleared the cut, 1 locomotive had frozen injectors near a drifted trestle, and no guaranteed delivery date remained for smaller settlements west of the line. Ketterly posted the notice but kept his shutters half closed and raised mash prices again before supper. Wainwright publicly called the delay temporary, then sent his foreman to buy what oats remained in town. Souls noticed the contradiction. They noticed, too, that Roy spent that evening not arguing at the store, but hauling 2 extra water barrels to the corral shed and bracing their hoops with rawhide so they would not split in severe cold. By the 2nd day of January, the warning signs multiplied beyond custom and entered the realm of pattern. Ravens flew low along the lee of buildings at midday and avoided open crossings altogether. The north pond steamed at dawn while air temperature read 6 degrees, indicating water movement below ice from pressure changes upstream. Horses in open lots stood tail to wind for hours without feeding, then startled at minor sounds and pressed against rails as if bracing for impact. Roy rode to Willow Draw with Eli and found beaver cuttings fresh above winterline, not below, and ice ridges stacked at odd angles where current had shifted under sudden cooling. He broke a crust sample at the drawbank and measured layered refreeze, 3 distinct events in 7 days. Returning at dusk, he stopped at 4 barns and advised owners to double-lash gate chains, move feed inward, and clear a direct lane to his lot in case of night transfer. 2 thanked him quietly. 2 said they would manage their own. That evening, under a moon ringed hard and pale, Wainwright gathered men at the hitch rail and repeated that fear had become contagious in Sage Hollow. He said Murray measured shadows and sold dread to the weak-minded, then pointed to his own painted yards as proof that proper timber and proper management were sufficient for any season Wyoming could deliver. The line drew nods from men who had invested in his contracts and could not afford to doubt them. Yet, while he spoke, his foreman nailed extra planks across the lee gates at Wainwright's main yard and ran new rope from post to post. Mockery and precaution were now operating from the same mouth, each for a different audience. Roy continued in the manner that had become his answer to every public performance. On January 2nd, he set 2 final marker posts on the south approach, each topped with shielded lamps that could be seen through ground snow. He packed ash and sand in barrels by every gate to improve footing when ice polished the entry lanes. He wrote names on a slate in tentative intake order, then erased the list and replaced names with function. Draft, brood, saddle, infirm, unknown. Ownership meant little once visibility failed. Capability meant survival. Late that night, he visited Clara's grave above the south pond with a wrapped lantern, stood through one full glass turn in the wind, and returned without ceremony to bank coals in the feed shed stove. On January 3rd, a deceptive calm settled over Sage Hollow from sunrise until mid-afternoon. The sky held a thin copper cast, and sound carried too far. Hoofbeats from the north lots striking like hammer blows across frozen air. The thermometer reached 24 degrees, mild enough to tempt delayed chores, and families used the lull to mend tack, fetch water, and speak of ordinary matters for the first time in weeks. Roy did not accept the calm as relief. He checked barometric glass at the schoolhouse, noted the drop, and went directly to the church bell rope, asking leave to ring a storm readiness signal before dark. Reverend Alden hesitated, then declined, saying alarm without visible danger would disorder the town. Roy nodded once, walked back to his lot, and lit all approach lamps an hour early. By nightfall, the western horizon had become a single dark bar with no star break above it. The first gust arrived at 8:17 by Roy's pocket watch, sharp enough to throw loose snow from roof lines in horizontal sheets. At 9 o'clock, temperature fell from 18 to 4 degrees. At 10:30, it reached -7. Eli arrived with scarf iced stiff and reported 2 pine panels already splintered at the bell livery after a gelding string surged during feeding. Roy opened the main gate, checked every latch in sequence, and stationed lanterns along the rope lane at 10-yard intervals. Across town, doors slammed, teams were shouted through darkness, and the painted confidence of autumn began to come apart under pressure that did not bargain. The work Roy had carried in silence was finished. The testing had begun. At 11:12 that night, the wind struck from the northwest, hard enough to flatten the flame inside Roy's first lane lantern, and within 20 minutes the gusts began arriving in layered pulses that shook doors on both sides of the main street and drove snow not downward but sideways, a white grit that found every seam in coat, scarf, and shutter. Eli took the south marker post while Roy held the main gate and counted arrivals by touch and shouted number, because sight had already narrowed to the circle of nearest light. The thermometer at Ketterly, checked by Deputy Marshal Edwin Pike before midnight, read -14 degrees. By 1 o'clock in the morning of January 4th, 1887, it had dropped to -19, with sustained wind above 50 miles per hour and stronger bursts that came like blows from a swung board. The first failure came from the bell livery, where 2 pine sections that had been patched in autumn gave way at the lower rails, when 12 frightened geldings pressed in one direction and then reversed in a single panic turn. Men tried to rope in the dark and lost footing in drifted manure and ice. Horses scattered into lanes where fences had disappeared under snow. Pike rode to Roy's gate with beard frozen white and gave the report in 6 clipped lines, then rode back with 2 spare halters and instructions to bring any recoverable stock by the rope-marked approach. That pattern repeated across the next 3 hours. 1 yard failed by hinge shear, another by post lift where shallow footings had loosened in alternating thaw and freeze, and one by complete corner collapse when a loaded drift pushed a weakened brace inward. Good paint did nothing. Straight boards did nothing. Pride did nothing. By dawn, Wainwright's largest contracted enclosure on the north side had broken in 3 places. Its ornamental cross-bracing snapped first, then the gate beams split where a knot had been hidden by whitewash. Darius arrived on horseback in his buffalo collar coat, cursing the wind and calling orders no one could hear 10 feet away, and watched 30 branded animals bunch against a lane that no longer existed. He sent men with lanterns to gather them, but lantern glass iced over and teams returning from the outer dark brought back fewer halters than they had carried out. At Roy's lot, Stone posts held their line under impact after impact, the inward canted gates tightening under pressure exactly as designed, while Eli and two volunteers moved arrivals from intake to settling court by hand on the double rope. At 8:40 that morning, Roy erased owner names from the tally slate and replaced them with condition marks: blown, lame, nursing, draft fit, frostbit muzzle, shock. Storm arithmetic had replaced property arithmetic. By midday, there was no clean boundary left between one man's stock and another's danger. Only a narrowing window before cold and panic finished what broken rails had started. Roy kept the intake lane open, reset lanterns as they iced, and prepared for a longer pull than any drill had modeled. Through January 4th and into January 5th, the blizzard built rather than spent itself. Snow packed against windward walls until porches vanished and doorways became trenches cut each hour just to keep an exit. Roy ordered ash and sand spread at every turn bay, rotated handlers in 15-minute intervals to prevent hand failure, and kept mash water moving in the firebrick trench so chilled animals could take warm feed before gut stasis set in. He allowed no shouting inside the courts, only numbered calls because panic traveled faster than command. By late afternoon on the 5th, his occupancy had reached 106 head, including 11 from Wainwright lots, 9 from Bell, 7 from outlying cabins, and a mix of saddle and draft stock brought by owners who had mocked the stone build in October. Roy received each team with the same instruction: halter tag, condition check, then to assigned ring. No debate at the gate. Sage Hollow's suffering widened from stock loss into household peril as fuel shrank and movement failed. Ketterly's front shelves, full in November, stood half bare by the 6th of January, then near empty where oats, lamp oil, and salt should have been. The price cards had been changed twice and then removed entirely when coins stopped mattering. Families burned chair legs, broken rails, and tool handles. The church kitchen under Lena Crowley stretched flour with crushed barley and rendered fat, serving thin mash by pail to anyone who could reach the door. Pike organized rope relays between 3 blocks of homes, tying lines at window height so souls crossing in whiteout could hold course and return with wood or medicine. Roy sent 2 sacks of reserve hay to the church for bedding and took no account against any name. By the morning of January 7th, the town no longer resembled a street settlement. It resembled a series of islands cut into one storm field. 3 days passed before the fiercest interval arrived, and when it came on the night of January 9th, it came with a force that erased even practiced habits. At sunset, the temperature stood at minus 28 degrees. By midnight, it had fallen to minus 36, and Pike's anemometer at the marshal shed, read by lantern before the instrument froze, recorded gusts past 70 miles per hour. Drifts climbed porch roofs and reached the lower window ledges on the lee side of buildings. The wind was no longer weather in any ordinary sense. It was pressure, constant and directional, testing each fastening, each hinge, each decision made in warm months. Thomas Hale died first. He had argued with Roy in December and kept his own smaller corral behind a new pine lane. But when one mare went down in tangled halter line near his barn, he cut through drift to free her rather than leave her to free standing. He managed the cut. He managed the release. He turned toward his own door and fell within 20 paces of it, one hand still holding the halter knife in a mitten, too stiff to close. His eldest brother and Pike found him at first gray light when the gusts slackened enough to search. They carried him inside on a grain sled and set his boots by the stove that could no longer help him. Lena Crowley died an hour before dawn in the lane behind the church kitchen, where she had been moving 2 younger helpers and a cart of hot mash toward the schoolhouse shelter. A gate beam from an older side pen, loosened by repeated impact and drift weight, dropped as she pushed the children clear of the narrowing passage. The children reached the schoolhouse alive, wrapped in blankets and crying from cold and fright. Lena did not rise again. She had measured rations for half the town through 6 days of storm and had sent others inside before taking cover herself. When Reverend Alden spoke her name later, he said she fed more souls in 1 week than many men had fed in a year. Deputy Marshal Edwin Pike died on the same night returning from the north fence line after guiding 2 trap teams toward Roy's lamped rope approach. He had tied the lead wagon to his saddle and walked ahead to keep the trace clear when visibility dropped to the length of an outstretched arm. Both teams reached Roy's outer marker posts. Pike turned back to retrieve a 3rd wagon reported near the pump and did not complete that return. Eli found him after daybreak, kneeling behind a drifted post with his rope still looped through one gloved hand and his face turned toward town. The wagon he had gone to find remained buried to the axles. His route marks in the snow, set by boot heel and rope drag, brought 3 later rescue parties home. News of the 3 deaths moved through Sage Hollow in fragments shouted between doorways and confirmed at rope lines by men too tired to soften facts. Grief and cold stripped argument down to utility. By morning, even the houses that had defended pride as policy sent word asking where to stage surviving animals for transfer. After Pike's death was confirmed, the last barrier of pride in Sage Hollow broke. At 10:15 on January 10th, with winds still high and visibility poor, a group came to Roy's gate led by Isaac Bell and 2 ranch foremen, one of them from Wainwright's own yard. Isaac's cheeks were raw and wrapped in wool, but he stood upright and spoke clearly over the wind. They had 23 more horses sheltered in a collapsed shed south of the pump, 3 too weak to move without sling support, and no intact pen left that could hold through another night. Roy did not ask whose brands they carried. He handed Isaac a warmed cup, placed him by the stove, and assigned Eli to intake command, while he selected 6 strongest draft animals already inside for recovery pull. Darius Wainwright reached the yard minutes later on foot, coat torn at one sleeve, polished boots wrapped in sacking for traction, the visible signs of status stripped down to a man asking for capacity he had mocked. He began with explanation, shifted to defense, then stopped and asked only this: how many more could the stone courts take without killing what was already inside? Roy answered with numbers, not grievance. 16 if they were mixed saddle stock, 12 if heavy draft, 8 if infirm unless they cleared the reserve partition and accepted strict ration cuts by weight. Darius said they would accept all terms. Roy corrected him once. These were not terms. These were limits. Help proceeded as procedure. Roy sent 2 teams on the rope lane with doubled traces, 1 sled with straw and blankets, 1 crew with lantern shields, 1 crew with spare halters marked by slate number. He placed Darius on gate duty under Eli's direction and gave him the least dignified and most necessary work in the yard, clearing frozen manure at the threshold so no incoming horse would slip and break a leg on entry. Darius obeyed without speech. By noon, 12 additional animals were inside and tagged. 5 in critical chill moved to the warming stalls, 2 laid down and hand-rubbed for circulation, all fed by measured mash in half portions to prevent colic shock. By dusk, the second retrieval brought 9 more. 1 could not be saved. The rest stood. The storm continued into an 11th day, but from that afternoon forward, Sage Hollow's surviving stock flowed toward one system, one set of walls, one method built on dead ground and called folly until failure clarified the difference between appearance and endurance. Roy stood by the tally board with charcoal black on both gloves and updated each line as animals came through the inward canted gates that did not fail. He gave the same answer to every soul who arrived with fear, with shame, or with both. Take the rope with your left hand. Keep moving. The walls will hold. Outside the courts, the winds still worked at every roof and seam in town. But inside Roy's lines, the rhythm held. Count, tag, settle, warm, feed, rotate, repeat. What had begun as one widower's refusal to trust Pine and Luck had become the operating spine of Sage Hollow's survival. Roy did not leave the tally board, yet he began handing pieces of his system away before the storm had fully spent itself, assigning each arrival a task that converted fear into order. One soul to thaw bits and buckles in warm ash, one to rub ears and fetlocks with rough wool, one to carry mash pails by number rather than by ownership, and one to read the slate tags aloud so mistakes could be caught before they hardened into loss. He opened his reserve shed and cut the first full stack of his late wife's marked hay without ceremony, then weighed portions on a hanging scale to the quarter pound, reducing heavy team rations by 1 pound each to keep weak animals alive through the same night. By the afternoon of January 10th, the church kitchen and the corral worked as one body across 2 properties. Roy sent Eli with a written list on fence slat, 8 sacks of mashed grain, 2 barrels of warmed water every 6 hours, and all cracked barley from Ketterly regardless of quality, so long as mold did not show gray. Lena Crowley's helpers, still raw with grief, returned pails of thin grain broth that could be poured into troughs for horses too cold to chew. Roy taught them to watch nostril flare and flank rhythm before feeding, because a horse near collapse could drown on kindness if given too much too quickly. They learned in minutes. They repeated it to others by dusk. Darius worked at the gate until his wrapped boots froze solid at the edges. No one excused him. No one taunted him. He scraped threshold ice with a broken shovel, dragged spent bedding to the lee pit, and read ring numbers under Eli's direction, while men whose contracts he had once signed now took instruction from Roy, as if rank had been blown out of town with the roof snow. The contrast stood in plain sight. Roy's ledger showed $214.60 spent before the storm, plus rope, hay, iron, and labor paid in exact coin. Wainwright's combined autumn contracts had exceeded $1,900 across town. Paint and speed had failed first. When wind eased to 30 miles per hour on the morning of January 11th, Roy sent out 2 rope-guided crews not to recover property, but to prevent further dying. He paired each experienced handler with one owner who had never worked under protocol, then required the owner to repeat every step before leaving the lane. Approach from shoulder. Blindfold if eyes were iced. Lift forehoof test. Tag condition. Move on line. A wrong order could fracture a leg in drifted ground. A correct order could save 3 animals in one pass. By lantern that evening, 42 horses had been transferred under this method without one gate crush or trampling surge. The inward canted leaves kept holding. The stone ribs kept holding. The walls held. 3 days passed before the final blow decayed into ordinary winter wind, and by January 14th, Sage Hollow could hear itself again. The silence after constant pressure was not relief at first. It was disorientation. Men stepped from drift-cut doors and looked at a street reduced to channels, with broken pine rails jutting from snow like snapped kindling, and roof lines bowed where load had exceeded hope. Roy counted his stock twice, then posted the board in open view. Surviving horses by condition class, draft capable, breeding reserve, infirm, unrecoverable. He did not hide losses. He did not inflate success. Figures were moral instruments now. The town clerk and Reverend Alden walked house to house with Pike's remaining deputies and recorded the new number by nightfall on January 15th. 287 souls. 3 named dead. Roy attended each burial detail when weather allowed. Thomas Hale was laid beside his father with the halter knife wrapped in cloth and placed near his folded hands. Lena Crowley was buried above the church lane she had kept alive with kettles and ration slates, and women from every block carried bread ends for a shared table afterward because she had fed them all. Edwin Pike was buried on the rise facing North Line, where the road crews would pass in spring and remember whose rope marks had brought them home. No formal confession came that week. Reckoning arrived by labor first. On January the 17th, two boys who had once thrown shale chips at the stone posts came before dawn with hand sleds and asked Eli where to stack clean gravel for thaw repairs. On January 18th, rancher Amos Bell brought Roy 3 unused pine gates and asked for instruction on salvaging the hinges for stone mounting. On January 19th, Ketterly reopened his ledger and attempted to charge emergency rates for oats, already promised to recovery crews. By sunset, 5 families refused to trade under those terms and pooled coin to buy direct from a passing freight string instead. Authority shifted without proclamation, from men who had priced confidence to men who had measured consequence. Darius made his first direct approach at the corral on January 20th, while Roy was checking frost split on a water barrel hoop. His face had gone lean, and the broadcloth had lost its immaculate line beneath practical patches. He spoke without audience. I named this place in mockery because I did not understand it. I sold rails I called sufficient because they were quick and profitable. Souls trusted that word and paid for it with stock they could not replace. I cannot unmake that arithmetic. Roy listened, then asked whether the North Lane crews had enough ash for footing. Darius said they did not. Roy handed him 2 sacks and a shovel list for 3 more properties. The conversation ended in assignment, not absolution. The broader reckoning came in increments over the next month, visible in tools and timber rather than speeches. Families who had crossed the street to avoid Roy now brought sledges to his lot and traded labor for instruction on wedge lines, lime lifts, and iron dog seating. Women who had once fallen silent beside Wainwright at church steps stood by the measurement stakes and copied ratios into household ledgers. 3 feet below grade for 10-foot posts, 18-inch socket, alternating gravel and slaked lime, tamp every 6 inches test by tone. Eli began teaching rope lane drills to boys and aging ranch hands together, blindfolding both so pride could not hide ignorance. By early February, the phrase Murray Tomb Fence was no longer spoken as insult. Foremen on rebuild sites began saying, "Build it like Murray," and no one smiled when they said it. On February 7th, 1887, the town council reconvened in the schoolhouse, lamps steady now that oil roots had reopened in part. Darius stood before the same desk where he had sought to discourage stock concentration and submitted a written transfer for the spring municipal contract, naming Roy as chief builder for all public corrals and winter lanes, with quarry right purchase costs paid from Wainwright accounts at $312 and no reimbursement requested. He read the figures himself so no clerk would soften them. Reverend Alden asked whether this was confession or transaction. Darius answered, "Both, if truth is allowed to carry both weights." The minutes recorded no applause. The vote passed without dissent. Roy spoke only after the vote, hat in both hands, voice level enough to carry but not to perform. My late wife taught me with her father's notebooks and with her own labor that winter work is judged in winter, not at contract signing. I did not build those walls to prove a man wrong. I built them because animals and souls pay for weak joints when weather arrives. If any among you seeks forgiveness as a word, I have little use for words alone. If any among you seeks instruction as duty, I will teach every measure I know, and you may decide for yourselves what to call that. He sat down. No one asked for more. Teaching replaced argument through spring thaw and summer dry. Roy set apprentices in pairs and rotated them from quarry selection to post setting, so no one learned only the easy stage. He charged $1 per day for skilled instruction when families could pay, accepted flour, leather, and labor when they could not, and required each crew to build one communal feature before any private contract: a storm lane, a shared feed shed, a drainage swale serving more than one lot. Darius kept his word on quarry rights and appeared often with wagons, quieter than before, taking correction from Roy in public when a socket ran shallow or a beam shoulder sat high. The correction was given without scorn. The acceptance was given without defense. By October of that year, 2 additional petrified corrals stood in Sage Hollow, each smaller than Roy's original, but built on the same principles of mass, joint discipline, and inward canted control. The church kitchen, in Lena Crowley's memory, added a permanent grain room with measured reserve bins and a slate board for winter ration rules. A rope marker post was set near the north lane where Pike had last turned back, and every autumn drill began there with a reading of route protocol before any horse moved. Tomas Hale's younger brother supervised one of those drills by 1889, carrying the halter knife in a plain leather sheath, not as relic, but as reminder that devotion without preparation could still leave a man in the snow. Years later, in 1902, the valley counted 3 petrified stock corrals, 1 municipal lane network, and apprentices who had never known a winter plan built on paint and optimism alone. Roy's hair had gone white, and his hands had bent at the knuckles, yet he still walked each line before first snow, tapping posts with a small hammer and listening for the clear ring that meant load would travel where intended. Darius, slower and heavier, still joined those inspections when weather reports sharpened, carrying the tally slate Roy had once carried alone. Their conversations stayed practical. Their history required no display. The first corral on dead ground still stands above the west rise, its posts dark with mineral grain and wind polish, its gates angled inward against pressures that return each winter in one form or another. On the feed shed lintel, cut plain and deep by apprentice hands under Roy's eye, the inscription remains: "Walls fail at joints, not at pride." Children in Sage Hollow read it before they learn ledger sums, and each cold season the town repeats the lesson in labor, in shared stores, in measured lanes, and in the quiet refusal to mock what has already proven it can hold. On the first Monday of November 1902, with dawn at 18 degrees and a skin of ice sealing the north pond, Roy stood beneath the lintel and watched 31 souls gather inside the original Stonewood court for the season's first drill. Children traced the carved letters with mittened fingers while their parents checked halters and rope rings by lamplight, and no one used the old mockery name. Darius Wainwright arrived carrying 2 slate boards and a sack of chalk, set them on the feed table, and waited for Roy to assign him a place. Roy put him at the west gate with Eli, where hinge testing still required strength and patience. The assignment was ordinary. The meaning was not. Roy began with the signs that had once been dismissed. He held up Price's weather notebook, the pages now copied in a cleaner hand by schoolteacher Miriam Holt, and read the old entries aloud. Beaver dams raised above springline, geese flying low and early in tight wedges, 3 hard rings around a winter moon, cattle bunching head north before pressure drops. Then he closed the notebook and pointed toward the ridge where boys had laughed 16 years earlier. "You will measure what you see," he said. "You will write it. You will not call it folklore because you wish for an easier season." No one answered with debate. Pens scratched over paper. By noon, the drill had shifted from lecture to labor. Roy opened the reserve shed and accounted for every stored item in front of witnesses as he had done each year since the blizzard. 6 tarped haystacks reduced to 4 by current planning, 2 mash barrels full and 1 marked for church transfer, 38 iron rings inspected and greased, 12 spare gate pins in the cedar box, 3 coils of tarred rope retired after fray and cut into short lead lines for training, 1 cracked lantern chimney discarded and replaced from municipal stock. The transparent inventory had become law by custom. Children learned numbers beside names of tools, and the adults signed the sheet before it was hung at Ketterly's counter. That afternoon, a rider came from the rail spur with a written report sealed by the freight office. The winter schedule would run once each 8 days until deeper snow, and settlements west of the cut were advised to maintain 60-day feed reserves. Sage Hollow no longer treated such notices as rumors to be argued at the hitch rail. Roy had the report copied, posted one version at the church grain room and one at the marshal board, then adjusted ration tables by 1/2 pound per heavy team to guard against interruption. The old uncertainty received its callback in ink and action, not in panic. 3 days later, on November the 6th, the council called an evening gathering in the schoolhouse to settle one question that had remained half-spoken for years. Who would carry Roy's method when his hands could no longer set posts? The room held nearly the full town count present that night, and the benches were lined with apprentices from 3 valleys. Reverend Alden opened with prayer for Thomas Hale, Lena Crowley, and Edwin Pike by name, then sat down without sermon. The reckoning began in plain speech. Ketterly stood first. Age and loss had bent him narrow at the shoulders, and his store ledger trembled in his hands. "I raised feed prices when fear was highest," he said. "I told myself scarcity justified it. I watched mothers trade wedding silver for oats while I guarded sacks in back. Roy sent grain to the church without marking a debt. I mark debts on everyone. I have carried that shame each winter." He placed a folded note on the desk. Transfer of 1/4 share in his storage barn to municipal reserve use. No charge in emergency months. He did not ask to be praised. Amos Bell stood next and quoted his own words from that hard season, the line every listener remembered. "I said stone does not flex and horses do not reason," as though that ended the matter. He looked toward the west gate where his brother Isaac now trained handlers. What ended the matter was this town surviving because one man built for load instead of looks. My old pine contracts cost me 47 head and 2 breeding years. Roy's methods cost me pride and saved my line. He offered his south parcel for a 4th shared winter court and asked Eli to supervise it. Then Darius rose, broad voice gone measured with age. He did not soften his history. "I named this place Murray Tomb Fence, so others would laugh where I felt threatened. I called grief a sickness because I feared being wrong in public. I sold confidence at $1,900 and more, and it broke in 1 week of true weather." Roy did not deny my animals gate space. He put a shovel in my hands and gave me work that kept them standing. I cannot repay Clara Murray. I cannot repay the dead. I can carry weight now or remain a fraud forever. He laid 3 documents on the desk: final quarry right deed to the town trust, annual stipend for 2 poor apprentices, and full release of any claim on municipal corral contracts. His voice thinned at the end. I was wrong. No one clapped. The room held silence long enough to feel its gravity. Then Reverend Alden turned to Roy and asked what should be done with apologies that had arrived late. Roy remained seated for a moment, hands on his knees, then stood with the same measured posture he had carried through storms and burials. "If you ask whether I forgive as though forgiveness were a receipt, I cannot issue it," he said. "Clara is not here to answer for what was said in her name. Thomas, Lena, and Edwin are not here to hear promises. If you ask whether I will keep teaching, I will. If you ask whether shame can be converted into shelter, yes, but only by labor done correctly when no one is watching. Bring your sons, your daughters, your ledgers, your worn-out habits. Learn to measure, learn to store, learn to share before the wind arrives. That is the only answer I trust." A boy in the back, 12 years old and newly apprenticed, raised his hand and asked where the first lesson began. Roy pointed to the school stove where a kettle steamed. "Moisture content in hay," he said. "Tonight." They moved directly from confession to instruction. On tables cleared of slates, Roy spread sample bundles from each loft and taught twist and break testing under lamplight. Then had Miriam Holt record thresholds in both pounds and visual cues, so illiterate ranch hands could still use the rule. Darius held the scale hook while Isaac called weights. Ketterly copied storage rotation dates and offered his backroom for overflow if church bins filled. By midnight, the town had a signed winter plan with names beside each duty, including burial teams, kitchen teams, rope-laying crews, and relief riders for outlying cabins. Every prior loose thread had a knot. Roy lived another 7 winters. On December the 14th, 1909, at age 63, he died in his chair by the feed shed stove after completing that day's post-tap inspection and marking 2 repairs for mourning. He was buried beside Clara above the south pond. At his request, Price's notebooks, Roy's ledgers, and the original 1886 occupancy slate were placed in a pine case at the schoolhouse, available to any apprentice who signed them out and returned them dry. Thomas Hale's halter knife, long carried in drills, was set under glass at the lane marker where Pike turned back. Lena Crowley's grain room remained active each winter and never locked during storms. The first corral still stands on the west rise. The posts still ring clear when struck. The inward canted gates still tighten under pressure. Each October, children and elders gather under the lintel, read the inscription aloud, and then walk the rope lane with one hand on line and one hand free for another soul. Freight notices are copied twice. Reserves are counted in public. Weather signs are written, dated, and compared. In Sage Hollow, practical mercy became civic practice, and the lesson endured because it was built into wood, stone, iron, and the habits of those who learned too late once and refused to learn late again.